Alright guys, today we're going to discuss American Indian literature, a paradigm shift. This is going to help you with your reading and understanding of The Lone Ranger and Tonto, A Fist Fight in Heaven by Sherman Alexie. Now remember, the first thing that we need to remember about this particular book, we've discussed it in class, although this is a novel and there are different chapters in here, don't be caught up in the fact that they're titled and they look like chapters. They're short stories. So this novel is a collection of short stories, even though it appears in the form of a novel. Okay? Now, while reading this book, we need to make sure that we understand a few things. So as I highlight these in the Prezi, what you need to do while reading the novel is make sure that you highlight in the book. Yes, I said highlight in the book. Use a pencil, write stuff down, ask questions. If you don't feel comfortable writing in the book that I have purchased for you, then you may use post-it notes or flag certain pages if you need to. Okay? Let's get started. The first major premise that we have with regards to American Indian literature is this. Nearly all American Indian literature has been a unique and vastly different perspective and structure than most mainstream fictional literature. It is important to recognize, analyze, and critique these structural differences to allow greater depth of understanding to occur. Guys, what we've seen in The Great Gatsby is we saw Nick Carraway. We saw how he presented the text not necessarily in a chronological order, but what he gave us was a typical outline to mainstream literature. We have problems, we have conflicts, we have a climax. We have all the things that you discussed with regards to short stories as well. Okay? Mainstream literature, as you're going to see a comparison in the next few slides, has heroes, has villains. American Indian literature, we don't have that. There's a completely different structural makeup which we're going to examine and going to discuss not only in this presentation but in the book while at school. The next thing we need to look at is this. Our primary concepts. American Indian fictional literature often effectively demonstrates the relationship Native people have with the world around them. Okay? It can reflect the concepts of Native people's relationship with the land, their spirit, and their place in the world. When examining these concepts, it is important to juxtapose mainstream literature with that of American Indian literature. Okay? What we have is that the Native people talk about the world around them. Okay? And mainstream literature often highlights man's individual journey within. We're not going to see that. Obviously, we've discussed that thus far with this novel. So, let's compare the two. What we have is this. These are the major comparisons that I want you guys to capture. Mainstream literature, often in a linear structure. Indigenous literature is cyclical. What do I mean by cyclical? Well, we have different characters throughout the different stories, and they appear in different ways. We see the struggle of one person in an earlier chapter, and then we see them before that struggle in a later on chapter or story. Okay? Monologic or dialogic, which is compared to the conversational structure or process of indigenous literature. What we see are essentially, we see a collection of ideas. We see one idea. Okay? Here we see a conversational aspect to different ideas. We see jokes. We see that dark humor that we talked about with regards to certain stories. Okay? We don't see just one type of logic hammered over and over and over again. We see it through conversation. Hierarchical, yes, versus egalitarian. Tongue twisted, sorry. What we see is a hierarchical structure to different characters. Okay, less importance, more importance. Whereas everyone on the res, so to speak, as Alexia would say, everyone is equal. There's no hierarchical structure at all. Okay, and we see that with mainstream literature. Think about Gatsby again. Gatsby is at the top of the food chain, right? Nick is maybe arguably a little bit higher than him. Okay, we have a hierarchy, and certain characters have a certain amount of importance. Whereas in this book, who's the most important character? We can't figure that out. If we were to watch Smoke Signals, then we would see that the entire story is structured around one character. Okay? But that's not the case in this story overall. Alright? Secular versus metaphysical. What we're going to see are a lot of dream visions within this book, right? We see the metaphysical. the changing of the physical shape through dreams, through visions. Okay, we have things that took place that actually didn't take place, and we're going to get confused by that. Those are the dream sequences that are discussed within the stories. Whereas everything here is secular in mainstream literature. Okay, again, think about Gatsby. Everything happens within a 3-month period. The ideas all come back to one another. They tie into one single idea, whereas the metaphysical doesn't transpire on the same plane. It could be something completely different. Okay? Critique of culture versus the critique of colonization. American Indians, as you noticed in reading some of these stories, if you started already, is that there's no real critique about the fact that alcoholism runs rampant, divorce runs rampant, single family homes run rampant, parents abandon their children. There's no critique of that within the story. What we see in mainstream literature, though, is critique of culture. We've talked about Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. There's a critique there. Great Gatsby, we're definitely seeing a critique there. Old money versus new money. They're critiquing the culture that we see here in America, and indigenous literature really critiques colonialism. Like if Columbus hadn't done this, okay? They talk about that quite often, but they never critique their own culture. We see in mainstream literature the plight of the individual. Again, Gatsby, I'm referencing that a lot because that's something we've already studied this year. Nick discusses himself. He discusses the actions of Gatsby. He discusses the individual and where they stand. Okay, again, looking back at the hierarchical structure. Okay, communitarian. Everything is community. Everything that people do on the res affects one another. Or, rather, we see them discuss all their plights in a community-type aspect. There's not one focus on the individual. When Victor loses his father, everyone sits there and says, man, that's too bad, and they talk to him about it. Thomas builds the fire, offers to help him out with money, but there's no real focus on how Victor feels about this. It's very interesting. It's not the individual. It's how the community responds. So those are the things that we need to make sure that we take note of when reading these stories. The next thing I want to touch upon here is this. The comparisons that we really, really, really want to see. Okay? I know there's a lot here to read, but this is some things that we really need to focus on. Mainstream literary paradigm has certain elements rarely found in native literature. A hero. I talked about that earlier. Clear-cut villains, plot structure, and concluding purpose, just to mention a few. Okay? Native literature is bicultural. Their characters move freely in the world, beyond and through stereotypes or cultural idioms. Much like the traditional trickster figures in native stories, if we were looking at Coyote and some of the other stories in the American literature book, you would understand that a little bit more. Okay? We're just going to discuss those. The concept is to see chaos behind order, an ability to laugh at themselves, to escape conformity for freedom. That's where the dark humor comes in. Okay? They helped provide another model that has a structure that allows for equality, helping others to have a good life. That's what they're going to argue. And we discussed that in looking at some of the short stories that Sherman Alexie has presented us. Even though there seems to be the anti-hero, the villain, they're not really villainous. They're laughing at the tragedy that exists. Okay? So, the Lone Ranger and Tonto fist fight in heaven. These are the themes that you need to find within the story because this is what we're actually going to assess. We're going to be looking at this either through a literary analysis or we're going to look at this through discussion board forum or blog. Okay? What we need to see is this. Love and hate. Resilience. Storytelling, especially with Thomas Builds the Fire. Forgiveness. Alcoholism. Tradition, which we see, they have a lost tradition. They're trying to find that. And spirituality. Now, this is something that it really takes a mature audience to take a look at. I think that we can handle it. But this is another possible theme or topic for discussion, and that is the forced sterilization of American Indians, which Sherman Alexie just briefly touches upon within the novel. He doesn't actually throw this out as a primary theme, but he does discuss the smallpox and the blankets, okay? and some of the other things that we saw with the massacre at Sand Creek. Okay, so there are a few things that we could possibly talk about, but these are the things that we really need to examine. Okay, so this is all I wanted to discuss with regards to American Indian literature and the paradigm shift that we've seen. Okay, and as we get through the novel, these are the things that I really want to touch upon in class. Okay, awesome.